Welcome back to another analysis behind the news. This week a very serious subject. As you know, we like to look beyond the headlines as to what's really going on, sometimes to understand the reason for the headlines. Sometimes there are things that are not being told because they want us to look somewhere else. Years ago, we produced a movie called Anarchy USA. And I urge that everybody go on YouTube and find that movie and watch it. One of the documents that we used in that movie was this book published by the ministry out of Algeria. And it's titled True Aspects of the Algerian Rebellion. And in there they document the fact that these so-called Muslim revolutionaries are actually communists. And they used all the tactics, for instance, beheadings and that sort of thing, that you see today. They also had a war on police. They would even get the crowds to attack police stations and that sort of thing, anything to break down law and order. Ultimately, the Algerian citizens were literally surrendered from within to this terrorist communist organization. And this individual took over. This is his mugshot. He is Ben Bella. And this is what he looked like after he took over, just giddy as the dickens, after performing all these acts of terror and murder and so on and so forth. That's a picture of him in his Mao jacket, by the way. It used to be very common knowledge amongst those who looked into terrorism that terrorism was emanating out of Moscow. Here, for instance, is a report of the United States Senate Judiciary Committee back in 1976. It says terroristic activity interlocks between communism and terrorism. We in the John Birch Society documented it. Congressman Larry McDonald documented it through his Western Goals organization. It was common knowledge. Back in the party Congress that was led by Brezhnev, who was the head of the Soviet Union and invaded Afghanistan, he came out in a speech before the communist parties of Russia and basically said that the banner of Islam may lead into struggle for liberation. Bad translation of what he was trying to say was that we can, through the use of Islam, have communist revolutions. We'll just disguise them. The banner, in other words, will be Islam, but really behind the banner is going to be communism, run out of Moscow. Here is a book published not that long ago by Ayan Mai Pachepa, who was the head of an arm of the KGB out of Bulgaria and Romania and those areas. And he said in this book, he exposes the fact that he was in charge of sending thousands of agents into Muslim countries who were Muslims, but they were communists. And they were sent into these Muslim countries to destabilize them, change society, ingratiate themselves into government and all other aspects. And included in that, of course, were communist terrorist trainers. And he said that he was only one of many who did that. That over a time period, there was tens of thousands of these agents out of Russia and satellite countries sent into these Muslim countries like Iran and Iraq and Egypt and on and on and on, in order to change those countries into what Moscow wanted them to change into and form terrorist organizations. Also, we see the books put out by Anatoly Golitsyn, New Lies for Old, and Alexander Litvinenko, who also pointed out the fact that there were all sorts of initiatives out of Moscow to radicalize Islam. Litvinenko, as you remember in these broadcasts, is the man that exposed the fact that the second in command of Al-Qaeda, al-Zawahiri, was a Russian asset, trained in Russia, who is now today the head of Al-Qaeda after we assassinated Osama bin Laden. So the head of Al-Qaeda is a Russian asset. So these sorts of things are not new for those of us who look at this. Even a report put out in January, about a year ago, of 2014 by the Eastern European Studies Center shows the fact of ties between the KGB, FSB, and GRU into these Islamic organizations. Now, the GRU, for those of you who may not be familiar with that, the KGB evolved into the FSB. They are primarily internal inside the Russian Empire. The GRU is military and is involved in foreign intelligence. And so they operate pretty much outside the empire into America or wherever it happens to be, Japan or Brazil or what have you. And anyway, this report shows that you cannot separate the things that are coming out of Moscow and Islamic terrorism, that they're intertwined, there's too much evidence of this, etc. This is the man who invented modern terrorism. His name is Yuri Andropov. He's the father of modern Islamic terrorism. He set up all the Islamic terrorist training camps. And he was also Gorbachev's mentor. This is the guy that Gorbachev learned, cut his teeth on, so to speak. Interestingly enough, in the last few years, Putin has put up several memorials to this man. You hear about memorials to Lenin and Stalin and that. Well, this communist KGB thug who rose to the top of the communist movement in Russia is Putin's idol. He just loves this man. Another one of the men that were involved in this was the supreme leader of Iran, the Ayatollah Khomeini. When he went into Iran after the overthrow of the Shah, he was working with the French Communist Party. Those sorts of things were coming out early on. Today, it's all Islam. It's radical Islam. Ladies and gentlemen, I don't care what label you put on it. You can call them Nazis or German extremists. It doesn't matter whether you're going to fight them or how you're going to fight them. You can call them Islamic extremists or whatever. It doesn't matter as long as you're fighting them. All of this business about what we identify these people as being is all subterfuge. For instance, does it matter whether we call them Islamic extremists or not? When you're not talking about the communists that are behind them, have trained them, have armed them, and nobody is talking about it except a very few, and generally speaking inside the United States, only the John Birch Society? Something, though, that is far more disturbing, and that is what's happening just across our border. Because all the headlines keep us and our eyes focused on the Middle East and the beheadings and the terrible things they're doing there. Ladies and gentlemen, if you go online, and I do not recommend that you do, in fact, I know that you will believe everything I'm going to say in the next few seconds by simply going online and looking for yourself. I ask that you do not, because it will scar you for life of what you will see. And I'm just going to flash just some pictures. These are all beheadings, dismemberment, all sorts of gruesome things being done to men and women south of the border, inside Mexico. Ladies and gentlemen, the situation in Mexico with beheadings and other things of that nature rise to the level, the breadth, the depth, and frequency of the Middle East, and you're not hearing anything about it. Just this last week, a warning went along out to the local TV stations down in Brownsville, across the border from Matamoros, and that sort of thing, saying that the killings are on the rise. Don't go into Mexico unless you absolutely have to and you know what you're doing. You didn't hear anything about that 150 miles away. You didn't hear it on ABC, CBS, CNN, Fox, any of them. This stuff is going on to the level of a massacre, and you're hearing nothing about it. One of the things that I think would happen if we did hear about it would be twofold. One, we'd actually have enough people finally saying, we've got to close the border. The other thing would be that we would also have a question in the public's mind: do we really want to be involved in these treaties like the NAFTA and other free trade agreements with Mexico when it is so unstable, when all of that could come pouring across the border at any time? And then we wonder why none of this gets talked about when you see Bill Ayers and Bernadette Dorn in their mugshots, who were the mentors for getting Obama involved in politics. You know, I've got to say one thing before we go. Thank you, Mayor Giuliani. At least somebody is starting to identify what's really going on in the federal government. You're calling a communist a communist. And I thank you for that. These are the sort of things that are going on you're not hearing about. You've got to start asking the question, why, and get serious about getting involved. If we don't, that sort of business will start pouring across the border. Until next week, we'll see you then.